Hey, how you doing? Good to see you. Well, it's an election year. Whoopee. A lot of contention going on. That's an understatement, and a lot of hand wringing. But a lot of the contention is within the church. It's not just in the culture. A lot of believers are wondering if they should vote at all. If so, who should they vote for? On what basis should they vote? Should they talk about who they're voting for? Should they leave the subject alone completely? How do they handle disagreements with other believers? I mean, this really is creating tension within the church as well as outside the church. And I think for us, the broadest issue is okay, um, as a believer, what is my role in this process? And how can I fulfill that role in the most God honoring way? Now, on this podcast, we always get back to the question posed in Romans 4:3. What saith the scripture? What does the word of God have to say about the issue? Today, we're going to ask what the word of God has to say about what Paul the apostle would say about the issue. It's what I call politics. Who would get Paul's vote and why? But hey, before we get to that, if you haven't yet subscribed to the podcast, would you please do so now? Hit that like button in the comments section. Let me know you subscribed. I'd love to keep you posted on what future episodes are coming up, future guests that we're going to be having. We've got some terrific people lined up over the next few months. I'd like to keep you abreast of our projects, my speaking schedule. So, hey, let's stay in touch. Please subscribe to the podcast. Okay, that said, let's get back to the question, okay? Who would get Paul's vote? More to the point, what was Paul's approach to politics, what I call PAUL-ITICS? Okay, three things in Paul's thinking that stand out to me: participate, policies over personality, and principles over party. Let's look at each of these. First, participate. I think one of the first things Paul would say to the modern voter is, hey, participate. It's your responsibility as a citizen. It's a question of stewardship. We know Paul was a Roman citizen. That was no small thing at that time. He was freeborn, according to Acts 16, when he was speaking to a guard about the fact that the guard was not allowed legally to scourge Paul as a way of examining him because Roman citizens were exempt. This was an interesting little bit of dialogue when Paul said, hey, wait a minute, it's not lawful for you to do this to a Roman citizen. And the guard said, well, I paid a great deal of money for my Roman citizenship. And Paul said, I was freeborn. He was born then a Roman citizen. Tarsus was a free city. That's where he was from originally. Roman citizenship, that carried some special privileges. You could vote. It wasn't a very nice voting system. Voting was for men only and primarily for property holders. And the more money you had, the more your vote counted. That wasn't right, but that's the way it was. But you could also own property. You could file lawsuits. You had exemptions. Why do I believe Paul would vote? Well, because he did exercise his right to exemption, as you can see in Acts 16. Also, Roman citizens had the right to appeal directly to the highest leaders in government. Paul did exercise that right in Acts 25 when he was before the governor Festus, and he said, "Now I'm in Caesar's court. I appeal to Caesar." He was exercising his rights as a Roman citizen. It's not logical to think that he would be so inconsistent as to exercise his other citizen rights and not exercise the right to vote. Now, why should we exercise that right? Well, it's a gift, you know? Many cultures and countries, historically and currently, have citizens who cannot vote, who have absolutely nothing to say about their government. I think it's downright sloppy for the Christian to ignore that privilege he or she has been given. That's the way stewardship works. To whom much is given, much is required. We've been given a lot under this system. Of course, we should be using it. It's also a form of influence. Now, think about this. Would you? Paul said to Timothy, 1 Timothy 2, 1-4, we quote this all the time, pray for all who are in authority. Why? So that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. He said, you ought to be praying for your political leaders that they will adhere to policies and laws and practices that are going to allow us to live our lives in godliness and in peace so that we can be free to do what we are commissioned to do. Well, Paul would pray for what was right, but he would also take action to advance what was right. I mean, Paul said to the Romans that we should remember the poor, and he not only prayed for the poor, he gave to the poor. He cared for the churches, but he didn't just pray for the churches. He cared for them by giving himself to them. So when he said, pray for all who are in authority, I find it completely inconsistent to think that he would simply pray for those in authority, but do nothing to influence who would wind up being in authority. And I think he would do that by voting wisely. Now, at this point, a lot of people would say, and I get it, I understand, what good does it do to vote? Uh, Times are crazy corrupt. I know that. A lot of people have lost confidence in the system altogether. But the question, what good does it do, is not quite the right question. For the Christian, the question becomes, what is the good thing to do, not what good does doing the good thing do? The commandment to pray has no contingencies. I believe our responsibility to vote has no contingencies either. Now, personally, no one is more cynical than I am about where we are as a nation right now. I believe there's probably a lot of tampering with the process that we are not even aware of. I get that. But the idea is not to let corruption keep us from fulfilling our duties as citizens. We want to expose corruption when and where we can. We want to fight corruption, and we want to vote and act despite corruption. I really think Paul would be kind of puzzled by the reluctance a lot of believers have today to be a part of the political process, to speak out, and so forth. I think it is bad stewardship not to, but I also think, remember, we've got a mandate to communicate, and voting is one of our ways of communicating. It's an essential way of communicating what kind of government we want to have so that we can, as Paul said, live peaceably in all godliness. Now, some would say at this point, yeah, but you know what? I don't like anybody who's running. I can't stand any of the guys that are running. I think they act like jerks or talk like jerks. I don't know. It's probably not that simple, but yeah, a lot of people do feel that way. Well, that would lead to a second point of what I call politics, and that is policies over personality. Policies over personality. Now, let's make a distinction quickly between voting for a political candidate versus choosing a pastor or a leader within the church. If we're choosing a leader within the church, we look at his spiritual qualifications, we look at his character, we look at his relationship with God, the gifting God has given him. We go with strictly biblical guidelines for leadership that determine whether or not that person has the kind of a relationship with God and the right character and basically the credibility in that sense that we look for anyone who is going to shepherd the flock. When you vote for a mayor, a governor, a senator, an assembly person, or a president, you're not voting for a pastor. Would to God that all of our leaders were godly women and men. I would love that. I know you would love it too. But no, that when we vote for them, we are not voting for shepherds. We're voting for people who are going to be guiding the country with the right kind of policies. That is why the policy is more important than the personality. If Paul voted, and I am convinced that he did, he frequently was voting for pagan men. I mean, Roman leadership was not known for its Judeo-Christian godliness. But he would vote for political leaders who would influence laws and policies. Now, he did not just pray that we be given godly men. He said, pray that the men who are in charge will be the kind of leaders who will allow us to live godly and peaceable lives. That means policies. Now, hey, ideally, yeah, the personality and the character and the policies would all align, but hey, that's not always the case, and I think you know that. I'm pushing 70. In my lifetime, I've seen a lot of presidents. I've seen some who I thought had terrific personalities. Uh, I think JFK had a terrific personality. Ronald Reagan, I thought, had a very winning personality. Uh, I certainly think Bill Clinton had a very strong and a very charming personality. Personally, I liked the way George W. Bush presented himself as well, okay? I think all these guys had good personalities. Now, I wouldn't vote for them according to that alone. I voted for some of those guys, not because of their personality, but because of their policies. I refused to vote for other of those guys, not because they didn't have good personalities. I liked their personalities, but I didn't like their policies. And conversely, I have voted in my lifetime for some guys who I didn't think had very good personalities at all. But their policies were policies that I felt were most biblically aligned and were in the best interest of the country. And for that reason, I even often said out loud, hey, I want that guy in the White House. I might not want him at my dinner table, but I do want him in the Oval Office. It's not the personality of the leader that is going to allow us to live godly, peaceable lives. It's largely going to be the policies that that leader enacts and follows. So, did Paul vote? Yep, it's a very safe bet that he did. How did he vote? I believe he would have voted policy first, what is in the best interest of the nation, and what is most biblically aligned with the types of values that we would want the country to be run by. Now, do we want our leader to be a gentleman, mature, circumspect? Of course we do. Yeah, that's a factor, but it is not the deciding factor. And that leads to a third point: principles before party. Unashamedly, I am a part of a political party. But the only reason I'm a part of the party I happen to be a part of is I believe it is the party most aligned with biblical values and whose policies generally are in the best interest of the country. But I'm not married to my party. So if my party shifts away from those principles, hasta la vista. My loyalty is to the principles, not to the party. And I believe that's exactly how Paul operated. His loyalty never overrode his principles. I mean, good grief. He publicly confronted a fellow apostle when he publicly confronted Peter, and he didn't allow their alignment as leaders to interfere with the need to point out where Peter was wrong. Comfort never overrode his principles either. Uh, I think we could all take a few lessons from Paul's example on this. Now, just for example, when he was speaking with Agrippa, he made no bones about the need for salvation. He gave his own testimony. He said that God calls all people everywhere to that same salvation. And he came on so strong and so clear that Agrippa finally said, you know, you're nuts. You're absolutely nuts. And Paul just threw it right back, plainly, politely, I suppose, but very clearly. I am not nuts. In fact, I wish that you could be persuaded. Oh, okay, principle over comfort. That was not a comfortable thing to say, probably not a comfortable thing to hear. That didn't stop Paul. He also didn't shy away from talking about moral principles. When he was talking with Felix, we read in Acts 24 that he testified openly and reasoned with Felix about, among other things, righteousness, temperance, like self-control, and the coming judgment. Hey, Felix was no saint. I mean, this was a guy who had a lot of lasciviousness in his own biography. So, hey, Paul was confronting immorality and talking about moral issues publicly to a leading political figure. So, memo to modern Christians: there is nothing biblical about us shying away from openly discussing moral issues. I think Paul would be puzzled and even a little ashamed of us when he sees how reluctant we are to speak on issues that are important, all under the guise of saying, oh, I don't want to get political. Well, I'm not crazy about getting political, but this isn't politics. This is morality. These are principles we're talking about. So to talk openly about abortion, racism, homosexuality, transgenderism, any number of social problems or immoral behaviors, Paul would not be at all familiar with this modern reluctance to tackle those issues just because some people today are either calling them political or calling them controversial. Paul never soft pedaled the truth in order to win other people or to appease his own base. Now, that leads to an important point. Yeah, notwithstanding what I said earlier about the personality being secondary to the policies, well, that's very true. I would vote in a person whose personality was not necessarily pleasing to me because his policies were right. However, I think we also, when a person is showing a lack of character, when a person is being needlessly out of line in his remarks or his behavior, of course we should be calling him out on it. And that doesn't mean we don't support the individual. There have been times with different leaders who I have supported and voted for, where I have also publicly said, hey, that was wrong. You should not have said that. He should not have said that. He shouldn't have done that. Now, did he give a rip? Of course not. None of them would know me. That's not the point. I think we need to be honest about the fact that when someone who we have supported, someone who we value and want in office is wrong, we should say so. That is a part of being honest, and that's a part of, again, not putting the party above our principles, you know. So would Paul vote? Yep, I believe he would. He would participate. That's basic politics. Would he place policy over personality? I am convinced that he would. And that also is a part of what I would call politics. Policy over personality. Would he be quiet and passive if a leader he supported was in the wrong? No, he would not. He would want the right policies. He would want the right leader. But when the right leader does the wrong thing, yes, the right leader should be called out on it. Now, all of that said, I think one of the reasons there is so much discomfort about this election year, well, probably a couple of reasons. One, election years are very painful reminders of how divided we are as a nation. I hate that. I'll bet you hate it too. It's demoralizing because I remember what Jesus said, a house divided against itself can't stand. I fear for the future of America if we continue to be divided, because Jesus himself said there's no future for a house divided against itself. That's true. Um, but I think also we're demoralized because it's like we're seeing the vision of what we always felt America should be dying. And I think we feel as though we're watching somebody on life support praying for a miracle to happen. And that is leading some believers to talk as though everything will be lost or gained according to who gets elected in November. And others are starting to talk as though the right leader in November is either impossible to find, we don't have one, or it's rather irrelevant, all is lost either way. Now, I am convinced Paul would avoid either one of those extremes. This was a guy who kept the main thing, and so should we. Now, what is my responsible then as a Christian American citizen? Well, to keep those two terms in their proper place. I'm a Christian first. What's my primary responsibility? Love the Lord my God, keep my relationship with him solid, be investing in that daily, drawing close to him, having my intimacy with him thriving. Then secondarily, my citizenship, yes, that's a stewardship I have in this life, certainly. So yes, I'm going to participate. And I am going to vote. And my conscience before God tells me to vote for the candidates, plural, whose policies are most aligned with biblical values and whose policies are most aligned with the best interest of the country. That is the kind of person who I believe would have gotten Paul's vote. That's the kind of person who would get my vote. To Paul, his Roman citizenship was an important responsibility. He took it seriously, but his heavenly citizenship, that was the top priority, and the one did not cancel out the other. So let's participate. Let's put the right policies first, even above personality, and let's make sure that our principles are ruling our policies. Keeping in mind what the author of Hebrews said about citizenship, your earthly citizenship, important to a point. But then remember what the book of Hebrews says about Abraham. We could do worse than to follow his example. He looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. There's our citizenship, and there's our top priority. Great getting some time to talk with you. Again, if you haven't yet subscribed, I would love it if you would let us keep up with you on our ministry here at Cloudfire. If you'd like to support this work, just go to joedallas.com/giving, joedallas.com/giving, and that'll show you how you can support the work of Cloudfire Ministries. I'll look forward to seeing you again then. This is Christians in a Cancel Culture, where we talk about how we as believers can talk in a culture that seems to be increasingly hostile to the very message we ought to be giving. Let's never back down on giving it, okay? Great seeing you. God bless you.